Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Aval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me this morning is Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss. She is a senior fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, Israel. Gallia, welcome back.
Thank you.
So I wanted to bring you back on to get your thoughts on the recent flare-up between Israel and the Palestinians and what that all means for relations with Turkey, because I'm sure you saw how vocal President Erdogan was amidst the 11-day conflict, and he referred to Israel as a terrorist state. His foreign ministry went around to many of the forums in the Middle East, trying to rally other countries against Israel. And all of this just brought to mind the question, our last podcast, which was about the prospects of reconciliation between the two countries. And you said at the time that it would take much more than just a return of ambassadors, for instance, at that time, to fix the relationship. But after everything, do you think that reconciliation is effectively, or chances of reconciliation are effectively over right now?
I think they are seriously delayed. I mean, as you said, this crisis in between Israel and the Palestinians came at a time when Turkey wanted to normalize relations with Israel. It sent all sorts of signals from Ankara in the past few months, and the most serious signal was the invitation of the Israeli, energy minister. He was supposed to come to Turkey in June for the Antalya diplomacy conference. And but this invitation has been withdrawn in this last crisis between Israel and the Palestinians. And we know also, looking at the history of Turkish-Israeli relations, that there is a strong correlation between developments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how good Turkish-Israeli relations. And when there's a crisis between Israel and the Palestinians, that usually negatively affects Turkish-Israeli relations. So had this normalization worked before the crisis, it is very likely that the ambassador would have just come to Israel and have been immediately withdrawn. So in this sense, this crisis sort of at least prevented this diplomatic inconvenience.
So it was probably more likely to have short-circuited it, even if it was successful, is what you're saying?
Yes, it would have been very hard. And this was actually the worry in Israel. And that's why Turkey sent all these signals to Israel, and Israel was not that enthusiastic about responding to Turkey, because first of all, it didn't know how sincere it is. And second of all, it wasn't sure that really things had changed in such a dramatic manner that now you could trust Turkey the way you did if we talk about a decade ago.
And there was one thing that I noticed that I wanted to get your opinion on also, and that was that Israel and its officials really did not bother to respond directly to a lot of the noise and uproar coming from Ankara, for example. The excuse me, the most vocal retort that I could at least find was in an interview between a Greek outlet and the Israeli ambassador in Athens, who said that the Turkish comments were saddening and irresponsible. And of course, the United States took the time to criticize President Erdogan for making what it said were anti-Semitic remarks in one of his fusillades aimed at Israel during the conflict. Can we take this quietness from the Israeli side as a sign that they do not really take Turkish criticism very seriously at this point, when there's conflict between the Israeli government and the Palestinians?
I would say two things. First of all, this is the fourth round of violence in Gaza since Israel disengaged from Gaza. And so in a way, it's like the previous rounds of violence. We know how these dynamics evolve. But on the other hand, it was a much more complicated round of violence. We had basically violence and threatening situations in several fronts. We had, of course, the situation in Jerusalem, in the West Bank. We had the situation inside Israel between, there were also violence between Jews and Arabs within Israel. We had all sorts of demonstrations on the borders of Israel, for example, in Jordan and Lebanon. And we also had rockets coming into northern Israel. So it was, in a way, a multi-front conflict, a lot of worries and concern. And then in this response, in this sense, I think they didn't want to open a new fronts. Like, we had enough on our plate in this respect. The other thing is that you were right. There was a lot of very vicious rhetoric coming from Turkey and also from its media outlets, that they were really basically in a propaganda war against Israel. But on the other hand, this rhetoric didn't do much beyond that. I mean, in terms of getting a ceasefire, Egypt had a major role. And in terms of if you need the funds, it seemed that they were coming from the Gulf. So Turkey basically played a very negligible role. Even if they compare it to 2014, when there was also an operation in Gaza, it was a very long one. It was 50 days of fighting. At that time, even Israel allowed Turkey to provide humanitarian assistance. There were Turkish planes taking wounded Palestinians. This time, really nothing, only very vicious rhetoric. And I think it did exemplify the weakness of Turkey.
And I think that one question that might be on a lot of minds is what the relationship is pretty much between the rhetoric, of course, naturally, and the prospects of reconciliation going down the drain. And that common denominator might be the President Erdogan himself, who's, of course, always been a very strident voice in favor, in what he says is his defense of the Palestinians. It's part of the old some call it the neo-Ottoman vision of placing Turkey as the leader of the Muslim world, and he wants to use support for the Palestinians to further that agenda. But none of that is, of course, very new. It's just that right now in Turkey, President Erdogan and his party are doing very poorly on the domestic front, and he's been making a number of big moves to shore up support within the Islamist nationalist base. How much do you think Erdogan's problems at home are really coming to affect reconciliation prospects for Israel? And if I can add just another part to that question, do you think that President Erdogan at this point is becoming, based on his own ideology and views, one of the major stumbling blocks to any true long-term reconciliation between Turkey and Israel?
Well, if you look at the situation in Turkey, obviously there are serious domestic problems. You have the economic situation, you had the lockdown because of the COVID situation, you had all these videos of this mobster, which were really are humiliating the central government. So you had all these domestic problems that definitely you wanted something to divert the attention from. And in this sense, I think the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians served this purpose, and I think that did add to it. But I mean, sympathy to the Palestinian is really overreaching in Turkey, and it's not only an issue of the Justice and Development Party and Erdogan. You saw all the opposition parties sign a statement against Israel. You saw the opposition party leaders also condemning Israel. You saw even a inner fight between these parties about condemning Israel. So you saw the JAP doing this banner against Israel on its building. So you had a really a strong reaction against Israel. I should remind those who are listening to us that it began in Jerusalem. I mean, the violence and all the trouble began in Jerusalem, and also in Al-Aqsa, and then moved to Gaza. So when it was centered on Jerusalem, and you had these very bad images coming out of Al-Aqsa, then of course this is a uniting factor in Turkey against Israel. When it moved to Gaza, the criticism relaxed a bit, although not substantially. So I don't think it's that Israel has only a problem with Erdogan, and I don't think Turkey has a problem with Israel just because of Netanyahu. I think these countries have moved in diverting ways that does cause trouble to the relations, no matter who the leadership is. But obviously, if there will be a change in the leadership in Turkey, and at least some of the worries about the survivability of Erdogan will be removed, then we might have something that is more like a more rational foreign policy, more realistic foreign policy. And also in Israel, of course, the prime minister is basically fighting for his career, and he also has this law case against him, and that of course also affects his calculations. So I think, and if there will be another leadership, again, it won't have a much more favorable attitude towards Turkey, but it might act in a more pragmatic manner.
So, and at that point, it would almost be like a reset for both parties, a fresh slate with new figures, new government to really just try to speak to one another frankly and see where to go from there. By the sound of it.
Yes, I mean, I think there are issues where Israel and Turkey are, I mean, on the same page, like the trade relations, which are only growing and being more diversified, and are really, if you look at it from a point of view of what we saw during the COVID pandemic period, we saw that basically you want to import from the closest countries you can, and for that, in this respect, this is almost a domestic market for Turkey, and I think this gave Israel some food security during this period of time. So if you look at it only from the trade perspective, definitely these countries have a lot to work on. I believe that also Turkey, I mean, Israel is now basically, unless we get some variants of COVID, we're basically over it. The numbers are really low, and basically the economy is in the recovery period from the pandemic. And I think Turkey is also gonna, I mean, soon they're also gonna, already 20% is already vaccinated of the Turkish population, and I think Turkey is expected to get the Pfizer vaccines, a major amount of Pfizer vaccines, which the miracles. I believe it will also do good to Turkey. Maybe not tourism as we knew before the pandemic, but we will see again Turkish airlines flying frequently to Tel Aviv. So that will also be a relaxing period. And we also have to see what will happen after, probably there will be the Iran deal between the Biden administration. I mean, the US will return to the Iran deal, and that will also create interesting dynamics in the region. And lastly, we have to see what will end with the charm offensive Turkey started when Biden was elected, and this charm offensive to all sorts of countries in the Middle East. We talked already about Israel, but also towards Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE even in a way. And we have to see what will come out of this charm offensive. If it will somehow relax tensions, I think we might see more interesting dynamics in the region.
On these structural impediments, so to speak, between Turkey and Israel that are independent of who's in charge of either country, these forces that really might make a long-term, stable, friendly relationship difficult at times. That always struck me as something that would make it more complicated in some ways for Turkey and Israel to find at least a middle ground again, compared to some of Turkey's other reconciliation drives in the region. Like at the same time, right before the conflict restarted in Gaza, we had the Turkish government and the Egyptian government having meetings for the first time in years, and they spoke about the prospects of further talks down the line. Egypt, of course, put its conditions right out there on the table as well for Turkey to meet if they want to have any normalization. This is also ignoring the fact that President Erdogan has spent the last 8 years or so, considering President Sisi in Egypt, one of his top five probably greatest enemies in the region. And then, of course, we had the meeting at the same time as the situation in Gaza between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, which also was a first in several years. Do you think that the in the case of Turkey and Israel, it was always found to be more complicated to create room for reconciliation than it was for Turkey in some of their other regional, the charm offensive, as you put it, to decrease tensions with these other countries like Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia?
This is a question I've been thinking a lot about when Turkey started the charm offensive, and in general, which country would it be easiest for Turkey to normalize relations? So supposedly, with Israel, it was only bringing back the ambassadors. The diplomatic relations were not downgraded in 2018 when the ambassador was withdrawn. So supposedly, it was just rather simple. But obviously, it didn't work out so well. With Egypt, it seems that it's going actually quite well. But again, you would think that because the Muslim Brotherhood is such an existential threat to the Egyptian president, and because today Turkey is basically the hub of all these Muslim Brotherhood exiles, then it's also quite difficult. So I mean, we have to wait and see. But it seems that this is a very big issue between these countries, and it's a difficult hurdle to overcome. And then let's take the UAE again. The UAE actually was even the normalization attempts came more from the UAE than from Turkey. But again, UAE is the interior minister in Turkey just accused again the UAE as being behind the failed coup in 2016 in Turkey, and we know that this mobster Becker is in. Well, he at least claims that he is in Dubai, and from there he's sending all these videos. So that also makes the situation complicated. So you would think actually with Saudi Arabia maybe it's the easiest because basically Erdogan has respect to King Salman, and you've had several conversations between them. And you would think here maybe there's a route to improvement. But again, you saw the Saudi unofficial boycott of Turkish products, and you saw the Saudis close the Turkish schools in Saudi Arabia. And you have, of course, the difficult relations between Erdogan and MBS. So it's not only King Salman that is playing here in the decision-making roles. So even that's not so simple. But again, you see these Turkish attempts, and it's definitely a tactical move. We'll have to wait and see if it's something more than just a tactical move that is made less from a sincere attempt to repair relations and more from an attempt to sort of sabotage some of the counter alliances that have evolved in the Middle East against the threat perception from Turkey, and to break these counter alliances.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of these counter alliances, there's one question also I really would like to ask you, and that is related to the strength of what is your assessment of how the Arab countries that normalized with Israel, with the Abraham Accords, how do you think that the conflict in Gaza really, what do you think that showed about Israel's new relationships with these countries, like in terms of their strengths or their limitations? Because Turkey, of course, made the rounds at a meeting of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation during the 11-day conflict, where they tried to rally as many Muslim countries as they could against Israel, but at the same time, they took the time to obliquely criticize the countries that normalized with Israel, of course, without giving names at the time. But we know who they're most likely aiming at, whether it's Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, etc. So, what do you think this recent conflict showed for the Abraham Accords in terms of its strengths and weaknesses, or limitations rather?
So obviously, these countries also condemned Israel on some of its actions vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but the condemnation didn't reach the level of the Turkish condemnations. I mean, the condemnations coming out of Turkey were much more fierce and even vicious in some respects. Basically, the agreements withheld. I mean, we didn't see any withdrawal of ambassadors or downgrading of diplomatic relations. I think one of the Israel was, in a sense, lucky, or it was also an Israeli decision that this round of violence would be short, that it would not, because had it been longer and had there been more tragic casualties, this would be more difficult to somehow maintain these relationships. But the relationship was held. Also, this what we talked about, the focus of this round of violence moved from Jerusalem to Gaza. As long as it was in Jerusalem, it was more hard to somehow contain all the feelings. When it moved to Gaza, it was, again, Hamas is seen as being part of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and the difficult relations between some of these countries' rulers to the Muslim Brotherhoods, and Hamas is not an actor that they like. So in this respect, this also helped. I think the Egyptian role was first of all very useful in reaching the ceasefire, and Cairo really showed its abilities in this round of violence, I think. And this also, of course, is linked to the Arab Gulf states, which are helping Egypt in other elements, especially the economic elements. So, I mean, it created a challenge, but nobody is surprised that if something happens in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and there's a violent outburst, then this causes tensions in the relations. But it was held. I don't know if we will see, I mean, probably the countries that have signed the agreement stay with them, but we won't see maybe additional countries that were considering to sign with Israel perhaps are now pausing their decision.
On my last question, I want to ask you something about a topic that we talked about last time, but also one that I know that you've researched since, and that is the relationship, so to speak, between the Eastern Mediterranean and the situation in the Middle East. And of course, that's a key part of the reason why Turkey opted to go on its charm offensive late last year on top of it, because just as Turkey is working on its reapproachment right now with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, in a couple of days, the Turkish foreign minister is on his way to Athens for talks with Greece. And I noticed that ahead of many of these meetings with Turkey, the countries that have become more aligned with each other, whether it's Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, Israel, they do seem to at least consult with one another ahead of any of these meetings, or at least directly afterwards, as if to keep one another abreast of what's going on. And Turkey has managed to make some inroads, of course, like with Egypt. They at least have the conditions back on. They have the talks going. They know what they have to do. And Saudi Arabia's case, they met with the foreign minister. But do you think that, given the persistence of some disagreements that continue to pop up, particularly like between Turkey and Israel, or Turkey and Greece, or on the Cyprus issue, do you think that the Turkish charm offensive that began last year, do you think it's beginning to run into something of a wall in the face of this new sort of array of partners in the East Mediterranean, Middle East?
I don't think there's an informal alliance between the Hellenic states, Israel, Egypt, and the Arab Gulf states is something that is going to be an impediment in Turkey's normalization efforts vis-a-vis these separate countries. I think, on the contrary, the threat perception from Turkey is something that is driving these countries closer together. And as if Turkey will be seen as less threatening, if Turkey will manage to normalize relations with one of these countries, and you will see that there's pragmatism coming out of Ankara, and that you can reach to Turkey's normalization efforts. I really don't think it's an impediment, but it's definitely happening. We see, I mean, these triangular relations between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus have been already more than a decade. Cyprus, Greece, and Egypt is also a triangular relation that goes quite a few years back, but has been strengthened under Sisi. And what's new in this last year has been the strengthening of relations between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the one hand, and Greece and Cyprus on the other hand. And here you really saw something quite dramatic happening last year. And it, of course, relates also to Greece and Cyprus existing relationships. So you saw, for example, a square meeting between Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and the UAE. You saw a joint drill in Greece, in which you saw the Israeli Air Force and the UAE Air Force flying together completely public and openly. And that's been really dramatic. And of course, these things are seen in Ankara. But as long as they push it to more pragmatism, then I think this will lead to a de-escalation process. The question is Turkey really capable of doing these shifts? Because if it is a revisionist actor in the Eastern Mediterranean, which 2020 saw a lot of these revisionist acts coming out of Ankara, then it can't really change. It can do some tactical maneuvers, but it can't really change. And then the threat perception persists, and all this counter informal alliance will also only strengthen.
Gallia, it's always a welcome. It's always a welcome chance to have these kind of conversations with you. So I really do appreciate you taking the time on this Saturday to speak with me about this topic. And the invitation is always open to come back on to Turkey Abroad, because there's always, of course, going to be something that comes up on this front, and you're the go-to for it on this program.
So thank you very much for hosting me, and I always enjoy speaking to you too. Thank you very much.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.